People think 1960s war movies were all patriotic blockbusters with square-jawed heroes saving the day. Wrong. Some of these films rattled the Pentagon, embarrassed Hollywood, and vanished from theaters before audiences could even process what they had seen. A few were too political, others too cynical, and some just too ahead of their time. But guess what? They're still out there, waiting to shock you. Ready to see what got buried? The Hook, 1963. Picture this: Kirk Douglas in a Korean War drama so bleak, the Pentagon wanted nothing to do with it. That's The Hook, a film that asked one explosive question. What happens when soldiers are ordered to commit acts they know are morally wrong? Hollywood had no idea what to do with this story, and audiences weren't ready for it either. The result? The film practically disappeared before it even had a chance to make noise. The plot centers on three American soldiers who capture a wounded North Korean prisoner. They're ordered to execute him, but the men hesitate. What follows isn't a typical battle movie with flag-waving victories. Instead, it's a nerve-wracking study of conscience, obedience, and survival. The Korean War setting only made it sting more, since the U.S. was still struggling to frame that conflict as anything other than a forgotten war. Kirk Douglas, already a Hollywood titan, took a huge gamble. He wasn't playing a larger-than-life hero here. He was a man torn apart by impossible decisions. Critics didn't know what to say, and audiences didn't know how to react. Was this anti-American? Was it just too real? The Pentagon certainly thought so. They refused cooperation, denied access to military equipment, and quietly made sure the film wouldn't get the spotlight. It's no wonder The Hook faded into obscurity. But today, watching it feels eerily modern. It challenges the idea that following orders is always noble. Instead, it shows the psychological torture of being stuck between loyalty to command and loyalty to conscience. For Douglas, it was one of the bravest roles of his career, even if most people never got the chance to see it. Morituri, 1965. Now, here's a story that sounds like a blockbuster on paper. Marlon Brando and Yul Brynner headlining a Wubbiuftik sabotage thriller. Yet, Morituri sank faster than the freighter it's set on. Why? Because this wasn't the kind of war movie 1965 America wanted. It wasn't about heroes charging into glory. It was about espionage, mistrust, and moral compromise. Basically, all the things the Cold War establishment didn't want to highlight. Brando plays a German deserter blackmailed by British intelligence into infiltrating a Nazi ship disguised as an officer. Brynner is the hard-nosed captain, suspicious of everyone around him. Sounds thrilling, right? Except the film leaned heavily into psychological tension rather than action spectacle. Instead of explosions every 5 minutes, viewers got endless paranoia, claustrophobic ship interiors, and Brando speaking in an uncomfortable German accent. Audiences were baffled, critics were divided, and studio executives panicked. The film's darker themes, questioning loyalty, showing shades of gray in the enemy, and stripping away clear-cut heroism, didn't match the Hollywood war playbook of the time. The Pentagon certainly wasn't eager to lend support either, since the movie didn't fit their narrative of patriotic, victorious America. To make things worse, Brando himself wasn't exactly cooperative. He reportedly hated the production, complained about rewrites, and clashed with the director. His performance, restrained and cerebral, didn't give audiences the fiery Brando they expected. The studio quietly pulled promotion, and theaters cut the run short. Today, though, Morituri feels like an underrated gem. It's a war film stripped of easy answers, showing the suffocating reality of espionage where nobody can be trusted. Brynner delivers one of his most intense performances, and Brando, love it or not, takes a risky swing. It vanished in 1965, but now it plays like the kind of smart, challenging war thriller Hollywood was too scared to embrace. None But the Brave, 1965. Frank Sinatra directed exactly one film in his career, and it wasn't a musical or a light comedy. It was None But the Brave, a grim Pacific War story that dared to show both Americans and Japanese soldiers as equally human. The result? U.S. distributors didn't know what to do with it, and the film quietly vanished after its brief run. The setup is striking. A group of American soldiers crash land on a Pacific island, only to discover a small Japanese garrison already there. Both sides prepare for the inevitable clash, but instead of the usual us versus them propaganda, Sinatra's film slows things down. It shows the soldiers' boredom, hunger, and shared desperation. Eventually, a truce forms. For a time, they cooperate just to survive. This was radical stuff in 1965. American war films almost never gave Japanese soldiers depth, let alone made them sympathetic. Sinatra, serving as both director and actor, wanted something different. He cast Tatsuya Mihashi, a Japanese star, opposite Clint Walker to embody the uneasy but real bond between enemies. The Pentagon wasn't thrilled. The film suggested that ordinary soldiers weren't enemies by choice, but pawns trapped in political machines. That didn't line up with the heroic narrative being pushed during Vietnam. Critics were mixed too. Some praised the realism, others called it slow and unpatriotic. When box office receipts sputtered, the studio cut marketing short. Sinatra never directed again, and none but the brave faded into obscurity. But, in hindsight, it's a fascinating anti-war statement from a man better known for Rat Pack swagger than battlefield grit. Watching it now feels like uncovering Sinatra's secret rebellion against Hollywood war cliches. The Bedford Incident, 1965. If you think Doctor, Strangelove was the only Cold War thriller to terrify audiences in the mid-60s. Think again. The Bedford Incident may not be a comedy, but it's just as chilling, and it disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. The story unfolds aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer, hunting a Soviet submarine in the icy North Atlantic. Richard Widmark plays the obsessive captain, while Sidney Poitier, in one of his rare non-civil rights roles of the decade, plays a civilian journalist on board. What starts as routine cat-and-mouse spirals into nightmare territory when a single misstep threatens to trigger nuclear war. Sound intense? It was. The film hammered home the terrifying reality that global annihilation could result not from villains or masterminds, but from human error and arrogance. That message wasn't exactly comforting to NATO allies, who reportedly complained about its blunt critique of military brinksmanship. The Pentagon didn't help either, refusing cooperation because it portrayed naval officers as reckless. Despite strong performances, the film barely lasted in theaters. Critics compared it to Fail-Safe and Doctor. Strangelove, but where those films found their audience, The Bedford Incident was quietly buried. Distributors pulled it after lukewarm box office and international pushback. Today, the movie feels frighteningly relevant. Its climax, sudden, brutal, and devoid of Hollywood heroics, still shocks. For Poitier, it was an unusual but powerful role, and for Widmark, it's one of his most unhinged performances. If you want to see how terrifying Cold War paranoia looked stripped of satire, this lost gem delivers. Too bad it scared its way off screens in 1965. Castle Keep, 1969. Now, here's a war movie that doesn't feel like a war movie at all. Castle Keep, starring Burt Lancaster, is part battle epic, part surrealist art piece, and that bizarre mix doomed it in 1969. The story follows a ragtag band of American soldiers holed up in a medieval castle during the Battle of the Bulge. Instead of focusing purely on strategy or action, the film turns into an allegory about art, culture, and destruction. Soldiers debate philosophy, ogle priceless paintings, and struggle with their own desires while German forces close in. Directed by Sidney Pollack, long before Out of Africa or Tootsie, this was a bold experiment. He tried to make a war film that wasn't about winning battles, but about the absurdity of war itself. Lancaster plays the weary major clinging to sanity while his men unravel in strange, often darkly comic ways. The result baffled nearly everyone. Critics dismissed it as pretentious, audiences walked out, and the studio quickly yanked it from circulation. Even Lancaster later admitted it was one of the strangest projects he'd ever worked on. The marketing didn't help either. It was advertised as a straight war picture, which left audiences confused when the movie turned philosophical and surreal. But here's the kicker. Decades later, film historians reappraised Castle Keep as a daring precursor to 70s anti-war cinema. Its dreamlike visuals, strange tone shifts, and refusal to glorify combat make it stand out today. In 1969, though, the world wasn't ready. The film disappeared into obscurity almost as quickly as the soldiers vanish into snowbound Belgium. The Victors, 1963. Every decade has at least one war epic that tries to say too much, and in the process says what no one wants to hear. For the 1960s, that film was The Victors. Written and directed by Carl Foreman, the same man who wrote High Noon, this sprawling World War II drama promised to be a masterpiece. Instead, it was cut to pieces, censored, and then buried by the very studios that once championed it. At its full length, The Victors ran over 3 hours and followed a group of American soldiers across Europe as they stumbled through the chaos of war. But don't expect flag-waving victories here. Foreman filled it with cynicism and despair. Soldiers executed prisoners, civilians suffered. Allies weren't always noble, and victories often felt hollow. The film's most infamous sequence showed a U.S. military execution of one of its own soldiers, an image that horrified audiences and critics alike. The cast was stacked with talent. George Hamilton, Eli Wallach, George Peppard, and even a young Peter Fonda. But no amount of star power could protect it. The studio slashed entire reels for U.S. release, watering down Foreman's bitter vision. European audiences got a slightly fuller version. But even there, the bleakness turned off moviegoers. In the middle of the Cold War, when America needed its movies to project confidence and moral clarity, The Victors delivered ambiguity and shame. No surprise then that it was pulled quickly from circulation. Today, the full cut is nearly impossible to find, which only adds to its legend. For Foreman, blacklisted in the 50s and still mistrusted by Hollywood, the film was both his boldest statement and the nail in his coffin as a major director. The Victors wasn't just suppressed, it was gutted. And what remains feels like a warning Hollywood didn't want us to hear. The Americanization of Emily, 1964. Imagine a war movie that flat-out mocked the idea of dying for your country. That's exactly what the Americanization of Emily did. And in 1964, that was enough to get it labeled unpatriotic and dangerous. Starring James Garner and Julie Andrews, this film flips the war movie formula on its head. Garner plays Charlie, a Navy officer whose one goal is to survive the war without becoming a hero. He brags about being a coward, refuses to charge into danger, and rails against the romanticization of sacrifice. Julie Andrews, in a role far removed from Mary Poppins, plays the British widow who challenges his cynicism. The script, written by Paddy Chayefsky, was razor sharp. Instead of noble speeches about duty, the film delivered biting monologues about the stupidity of war and the uselessness of dying for abstract ideals. Chayefsky wasn't interested in myths, he wanted to puncture them. One standout scene has Garner raging that war is the only chance a man gets to show what he's worth, by dying. Lines like that weren't exactly Pentagon approved, and sure enough, the U.S. military refused any cooperation. Critics were divided too. Some hailed it as brave satire, others blasted it as disrespectful to veterans. Audiences, meanwhile, were unsure how to process it. A black comedy about cowardice, with Julie Andrews of all people? The studio gave it a limited push, then quietly shuffled it aside. Today, the Americanization of Emily looks prophetic. It anticipated the anti-war mood that would dominate later in the Vietnam era. But in 1964, it was simply too far ahead of its time. Garner later called it his favorite role, precisely because it was so daring. The fact that it disappeared so quickly proves just how threatening Hollywood thought its message really was. The Secret War of Harry Frigg, 1968. By the late 60s, audiences wanted either big war spectacles or gritty anti-war realism. The Secret War of Harry Frigg gave them neither, and that's why it vanished almost overnight. Paul Newman stars as a low-ranking Army private with a knack for escaping confinement. Instead of punishing him, the military recruits him for a bizarre mission: infiltrate an Italian villa where a group of Allied generals are being held as prisoners. The catch? He has to pose as a high-ranking officer himself. On paper, it sounds like a clever mix of comedy and war adventure. In practice, it baffled everyone. Newman leaned into charm and wit, but the story veered between slapstick and melodrama. One moment he's cracking jokes, the next he's seducing an Italian countess, and then suddenly he's leading a serious escape mission. The tonal whiplash was so strong that critics didn't know whether to laugh or groan. The studio expected Newman's star power to carry it, but audiences weren't buying. War comedies could work. MASH proved that just 2 years later. But Harry Frigg wasn't biting satire. It was too lightweight to be taken seriously, and too earnest to be funny. Promotion was scaled back within weeks, and by the end of 1968, the movie had already sunk without a trace. Newman later admitted it wasn't one of his best, but in retrospect, the film has a strange charm. Its mishmash of tones reflects a Hollywood still figuring out how to deal with war on screen. Unlike the dark cynicism of The Victors or Castle Keep, Harry Frigg tried to wink at the audience, and got punished for it. It's the kind of misfire that makes you wonder, was it really that bad, or just released in the wrong decade? The Thin Red Line, 1964. Most people only know The Thin Red Line as Terrence Malick's 1998 epic. But here's the twist. There was an earlier version in 1964 that nearly vanished from history. Directed by Andrew Martin, this first adaptation of James Jones's novel arrived with high expectations, but was quickly buried after its release. Unlike Malick's dreamlike version, Martin's The Thin Red Line is stripped down and gritty. It follows two soldiers during the brutal Guadalcanal campaign in World War II. Instead of grand speeches or sweeping orchestras, the film zeroes in on exhaustion, fear, and the grinding misery of combat. You can practically feel the mud under the soldiers' boots and the endless heat pressing down. Sounds powerful, right? The problem was timing. By 1964, audiences had been fed years of polished World War II films with noble heroes. This movie showed something darker. Young men cracking under pressure, questioning authority, and struggling with the futility of their mission. Critics thought it was too raw, too cynical, and too small to be meaningful. The studio, sensing a flop, pulled its promotion and let it die quietly. It didn't help that Martin was better known for second-unit work on big films like Ben-Hur. Without a prestige director's name to sell it, The Thin Red Line slipped through the cracks. Even the novel's reputation couldn't save it. But here's the thing. Looking back, this early version feels like a lost blueprint for the anti-war cinema that would dominate the 70s. It might not have Malick's poetry, but it had guts. If you can find clips today, you'll see flashes of a war film that dared to tell the truth years before Hollywood was ready to listen. Hell to Eternity, 1960. Let's be clear, 1960 counts as the start of the decade, and Hell to Eternity deserves a spot on this list because of just how controversial it was. Based on the true story of Guy Gabaldon, a Marine who captured hundreds of Japanese soldiers by talking them into surrendering, the film should have been celebrated as patriotic gold. Instead, it got buried for being way too honest about the enemy. Jeffrey Hunter stars as Gabaldon, a Mexican-American raised by a Japanese-American family. When war breaks out, he's caught between cultures. Unlike most Hollywood films of the time, Hell to Eternity didn't demonize the Japanese. It actually showed civilians as sympathetic, even tragic, and highlighted the racism faced by Japanese Americans back home. That nuance was almost unheard of in 1960. The Pentagon wasn't thrilled. Studios usually loved making films about real heroes, but this one cut too close to political nerves. At a time when America was still selling World War II as a good war, this film pointed to contradictions that didn't fit the myth. As a result, it got a lukewarm release, limited distribution, and almost no promotion. For Hunter, who was still building a career, it should have been a breakout. Instead, it was quickly forgotten. Today, though, the movie feels groundbreaking, one of the rare early films to confront wartime prejudice and cultural complexity head-on. It's ironic. A film about a man who brought soldiers out of hiding ended up being shoved into obscurity by the very country it honored. Lost Command, 1966. Anthony Quinn, Alain Delon, George Segal, this cast should have guaranteed box office success. Instead, Lost Command was dead on arrival, quietly suppressed because of its explosive subject matter, colonial wars. Based on Jean Lartigui's novel The Centurions, the film tackles the French defeat in Indochina and the brutal war in Algeria. Quinn plays Colonel Raspagai, a hard-nosed officer trying to maintain control as his army faces both political and moral collapse. Unlike typical Hollywood war stories, this one wasn't about America. It was about Europe's unraveling empires, and the parallels to Vietnam were impossible to ignore. That was exactly the problem. By 1966, the US was knee-deep in Vietnam and didn't want audiences drawing connections between Algeria's quagmire and their own. The Pentagon offered zero support, and American distributors pushed the film out quietly with little fanfare. Critics called it bleak, heavy-handed, and dangerously political. But strip away the box office failure, and you've got a film that hit uncomfortably close to home. Quinn's performance is ferocious. Delon simmers with restrained intensity, and the battle scenes are staged with startling realism. The moral gray areas, torture, insurgency, broken loyalties were too raw for 1960s audiences, but eerily predictive of the debates that would rage over Vietnam just a few years later. It didn't just disappear by accident, it was buried. Today, Lost Command looks like the kind of war film Hollywood never wanted American audiences to see. Play Dirty, 1969. Michael Caine had already made his name as the sharp, stylish anti-hero of the 60s, but in Play Dirty, he dove into something much darker. Set in North Africa during World War II, this was no heroic desert adventure. Instead, it was a cynical, mud-stained trek through betrayal, brutality, and chaos. And that tone is exactly why the film barely saw daylight in America. Caine plays Captain Douglas, an oil executive forced into leading a mission behind enemy lines with a team of convicts, mercenaries, and cutthroats. He's the opposite of the confident war hero. He's inexperienced, nervous, and completely out of his depth. Command comes from Nigel Davenport's ruthless officer, who seems more interested in survival and profit than patriotism. The mission? Blow up German fuel supplies. But the real story is about greed, mistrust, and the futility of war. Director André de Toth, known for gritty realism, refused to sugarcoat anything. Instead of clean uniforms and noble speeches, Play Dirty shows soldiers stabbing each other in the back, sometimes literally. Even the desert isn't glamorous. It's an endless wasteland of dust, sweat, and exhaustion. The final twist ending, brutal and merciless, left audiences stunned. No heroism, no redemption, just futility. That didn't fly in. 1969. American audiences were already uneasy with Vietnam protests growing louder, and this movie felt too close to reality. Columbia Pictures, sensing the danger, buried its promotion in the U.S. Overseas, it fared a little better, but even there, critics dismissed it as too bleak. For Caine, who delivered one of his most underrated performances, the film became a forgotten footnote in his career. Today, Play Dirty plays like a revelation. It's the anti-Dirty Dozen, a war movie that strips away all illusions of camaraderie and glory. Watching it now, you realize why Hollywood let it vanish. It was just too honest about how ugly war really is. So, there you have it. 12 war films from the 60s that Hollywood and the Pentagon didn't want you to remember. Too cynical, too political, or just too daring. They disappeared from theaters long before they could leave a mark. But that's what makes rediscovering them so fascinating. Which one of these forgotten films surprised you most? Drop your pick in the comments. Hit subscribe for more hidden cinema. And remember, sometimes the stories buried deepest are the ones that tell the most truth.